The morning mist clung low over the hedgerows, a pale veil hiding the scars of battle that stretched across the fields of Normandy. It was July 1944, and the long-promised breakout from the beaches had slowed to a crawl. Sherman tanks, once symbols of unstoppable momentum, now lay scattered and blackened across the bocage countryside. Corporal Sam Hayes moved carefully among the wreckage of one such battlefield, the acrid stench of burned oil and cordite heavy in the air. He had seen destroyed vehicles before. He had spent months keeping the armored spearhead of the 3rd Armored Division running, but nothing prepared him for the charred shell that had once been the company's lead tank. The turret was peeled open like a tin can. The interior was blackened beyond recognition. Of the 5 men who had crewed it, none had survived. They hadn't even had time to open the hatches. Hayes crouched beside the hull and ran his calloused hand along the jagged entry hole left by a German 75mm round. The shell had punched clean through the side armor, ignited the ammunition stowed in the sponsons, and turned the entire vehicle into a fireball in seconds. It was a pattern he was beginning to recognize too well. Again and again, Sherman tanks were being destroyed not by catastrophic structural damage, but by the internal detonation of their own ammunition. German crews called them Tommy Cookers, a grim reference to their tendency to ignite almost instantly after being hit. Among American tankers, another nickname had taken hold, Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter advertised with the slogan, "Lights every time." Hayes was no engineer. He had joined the Army as a mechanic because he understood machines better than people. Back home in Illinois, he had kept tractors and threshers alive long past their prime, fixing problems with baling wire and intuition. The Army valued that kind of practical skill. In the months leading up to D-Day, he had learned to strip a Sherman down to its bare chassis and rebuild it piece by piece. But now, knee-deep in the wreckage of a platoon that had been alive only minutes earlier, he felt the limits of his training pressing down on him. He could replace a transmission or realign a turret gear. What he could not replace were the 5 men who had burned to death because a design flaw had turned their tank into a coffin. He began asking questions. Tank crews he spoke with all shared the same fear. They trusted the Sherman's engine, its mobility, even its gun, but they did not trust its ability to protect them. German anti-tank weapons sliced through the armor with unnerving ease. Once inside, the enemy's shells found the ammunition racks lining the hull and turret basket. A single penetrating hit was enough to trigger a chain reaction that no amount of fire suppression could stop. Hayes watched men carry buckets of sand and water to extinguish fires that were over in seconds. He saw loaders crawl from hatches with uniforms still smoking. It wasn't just a mechanical failure. It was a systemic flaw, one that official manuals did little to address. Every night, after the depot's engines had gone silent and the field lamps cast long shadows over rows of tanks awaiting repair, Hayes sat with his notebook and sketched. He drew crude diagrams of ammo racks, armor angles, and blast patterns. He studied photographs of burned-out Shermans, tracing the paths of incoming rounds. His questions became obsessions. Could ammunition be moved to a safer location? Could it be shielded from heat and shrapnel? Could a simple chain save even a few seconds, enough for a crew to escape before fire consumed the interior? The answers weren't in any Army technical bulletin. They weren't part of his orders, but they might mean the difference between life and death for the men whose tanks he worked on. The official line from Ordnance Command was clear. Follow the manual, stick to specifications, do not alter government property. But standing amid the twisted steel of yet another burned-out Sherman, Hayes found those rules harder and harder to justify. The war was moving into a phase where every inch of ground was bought with lives, and in the hedgerows of Normandy, German gunners were exacting a heavy price. If something didn't change, the slaughter would continue. Not because the Americans lacked courage, but because their tanks were killing them as surely as the enemy was. As the weeks wore on, Hayes' frustration deepened into resolve. He started experimenting quietly, cutting scrap armor plates from wrecked tanks and welding them into makeshift shields around ammunition racks. He salvaged asbestos padding from ruined vehicles and stuffed it into the sponsons to dampen heat. It was crude, improvised, and completely unauthorized, but it was a beginning. And in the back of his mind, one thought kept returning. If he could make even one Sherman survive a hit otherwise wouldn't have, The risk of breaking the rules would be worth it. The front lines moved slowly, measured in hedgerows and fields of wheat. Every day brought new casualties and new wreckage to study. And every day, Corporal Sam Hayes grew more certain that the solution would not come from a distant design bureau or a committee in Washington. It would come from men who lived and died inside these machines, and from one mechanic determined to stop watching them burn. The Sherman was a contradiction on tracks, a machine both celebrated and cursed by those who fought in it. On paper, it was everything an army could want: fast, maneuverable, mechanically reliable, and easy to produce in massive numbers. American factories built them by the thousands, and by the summer of 1944, they rolled across Europe in an unstoppable tide of olive drab. But for the men sealed inside them, the Sherman's strengths often meant little compared to its most infamous flaw. A single well-placed German round could transform the tank from a powerful weapon into a blazing tomb in seconds. It wasn't just a fear, it was a statistical certainty. Crews knew it, commanders knew it, and mechanics like Sam Hayes saw the proof every time they dragged another char hull back to the depot. The root of the problem was twofold. The Sherman's armor, designed for speed and mass production, was thinner than that of its German counterparts. Where a Tiger or Panther boasted thick, sloped steel capable of shrugging off most Allied shells, the Sherman's relatively light plating offered only limited protection against the 75mm and 88mm guns that prowled the battlefield of France. German rounds cut through it like a hot knife through butter, but it was what happened after penetration that made the Sherman notorious. Once a shell punched into the fighting compartment, it often struck the tank's greatest vulnerability: its ammunition storage. Early Sherman designed storage shells along the sponsons and beneath the turret floor, areas dangerously exposed to incoming fire. The propellant inside those shells was highly flammable, and once ignited, it turned the tank's interior into an inferno. Even if the crew wasn't killed instantly by shrapnel or overpressure, the resulting fire left them with only seconds to escape. And more often than not, they didn't. Hatch handles warped in the heat, flames licked through cramped compartments, and smoke filled the air faster than lungs could draw a breath. Survivors recalled the sound of trapped comrades banging on armor as the fire consumed them. Others spoke of climbing out of hatches only to find their uniforms still burning. The Army's official manuals offered little solace. The recommended procedures focused on preventing fuel leaks, maintaining fire extinguishers, and training crews in rapid evacuation drills. None of these addressed the fundamental issue. The tank's design itself made it dangerously prone to catastrophic fires. Reports circulated among field units documenting the problem. But with the war raging and production schedules already stretched to capacity, change was slow. The Sherman's role as the backbone of Allied armor meant it had to remain in the field, flaws and all. For Hayes, who spent his days knee-deep in grease and steel, the consequences were personal. Every burned-out hull that arrived in his workshop carried the same story: a glancing hit, a flash, a crew that never made it out. The details varied, but the outcome was always the same: scorched interiors, melted ammunition racks, and blackened fragments of what had once been men. He would stand in the wreckage, wiping soot from his hands, and wonder how many of those deaths might have been preventable. It wasn't enough to simply repair what was broken. Something deeper was wrong. The tankers knew it too. Over coffee brewed from powder rations, they spoke in bitter jokes about their odds of survival. They called their vehicles Ronsons, after the lighter that ignited on the first strike. They swapped stories of tanks hit once and bursting into flames before anyone could even reach the hatch. Some crews developed their own desperate measures, removing ammunition from the sponsons, padding storage areas with sandbags, or carrying fewer shells than their tanks were designed to hold. None of it made much difference. Against the brutal physics of high-velocity anti-tank rounds, improvisation was a thin shield. What troubled Hayes most was how predictable it had all become. After enough wrecks, he could trace the chain of events almost by instinct. The first hit punched through the side armor, usually low on the hull. The shell fragmented, scattering white-hot shards across the fighting compartment. Those shards ignited the propellant charges stacked neatly beside the hull wall, and within seconds the tank was engulfed. It was as if the enemy had been handed a blueprint for destruction, and, in a way, they had. The Sherman's very design invited catastrophe. The more he saw, the harder it became for Hayes to accept the situation as unchangeable. He had enlisted to fix machines, but now the problem felt larger than any repair order. The system itself was broken, a combination of engineering compromises and logistical realities that left crews with little more than luck to protect them. And yet, despite all the evidence, the official response was to keep producing the same tank, in the same way, and hope that numbers would make up for its deficiencies. Hayes was beginning to believe that numbers weren't enough. It didn't matter how many Shermans rolled off the assembly lines, that their crews were being burned alive inside them. Something had to change, and if no one else was going to do it, maybe, just maybe, he would. The depot near St. Lo was nothing more than a collection of canvas tents and corrugated sheds thrown together in the wake of the Normandy landings. Trucks rumbled in and out day and night, hauling crippled Shermans back on the front lines and delivering parts scavenged from salvage yards across France. The air smelled of oil, scorched metal, and wet earth, a mechanic's world, improvised and utilitarian. Corporal Sam Hayes had been working there for weeks, sleeping in a cot wedged between a workbench and a stack of spare track links. The official orders were simple: repair, refit, and return every Sherman that came in. But Hayes had stopped seeing those orders as enough. Every tank he patched up was another that might roll out and become a coffin for its crew. The manuals told him how to replace broken parts and tighten bolts to regulation torque. They did not tell him how to stop men from dying. He had never been one for rule books anyway. Back in Illinois, long before the war, Hayes had grown up fixing what his family couldn't afford to replace. The tractors on his father's farm were second-hand relics, held together by welding rod and stubbornness. There were no manuals for that kind of work, only problem-solving and instinct. By the time he enlisted, he could strip down a harvester blindfolded and weld a cracked manifold with scrap iron and a coal forge. The Army liked that kind of skill, but it also tried to tame it. Procedures, checklists, and inspections were drilled into every mechanic. Hayes followed them when they made sense. But when they didn't, when they failed to address the reality he saw daily in burned-out tanks and dead crews, he began to wonder whether obedience was a luxury he could afford. Late at night, after the depot quieted down, Hayes sat at his workbench under the flicker of a single bulb. There, among grease-stained schematics and bent shell casings, he began to sketch. The drawings were crude: cross-sections of hull interiors, diagrams of ammunition racks, outlines of armor plates. They were not the tidy engineering plans issued from Detroit or Aberdeen. They were sketches born of observation, of long hours spent crawling through blackened interiors of destroyed Shermans. He traced where shells had entered and where fires had started. He mapped the vulnerable zones and marked the points where a few extra millimeters of steel or a different storage angle might have made a difference. The more he sketched, the more radical his ideas became. What if the ammunition could be moved lower, away from the thin side armor? What if it could be shielded behind a water jacket, or wrapped in padding to absorb fragments? What if compartments could be welded over the most vulnerable areas to contain a blast before it spread? These were not field repairs. They were redesigns. And every single one of them was forbidden. Army regulations were explicit. No structural modifications to armored vehicles without written authorization from Ordnance Command. Unauthorized changes could compromise performance, void warranties, and, if discovered, end careers. Hayes knew all of that. He also knew that regulations were written by men who had never seen a Sherman crew die inside their own tank. They hadn't watched loaders burned alive while clutching useless fire extinguishers, or seen drivers dragged from hatches with their boots melted to the deck. He had. And so, night after night, the sketches piled up. During the day, he tested small changes under the radar. A bracket shifted here. A reinforcement welded there. None of it was enough to draw official attention, but each modification was a step closer to something more daring. When a tank came in with a completely destroyed interior, he used it as a laboratory, cutting, welding, experimenting with configurations he'd never dare try on an operational vehicle. He scavenged water tanks from wrecked trucks and fitted them around ammunition racks. He bolted on extra armor plates cut from scrap Panther hulls. He even rigged a rudimentary fire suppression system using aircraft fuel lines and pressurized canisters. Word began to spread quietly among the crews. Hayes wasn't just fixing tanks. He was reimagining them. Some tank commanders would slip him coffee or cigarettes in exchange for a little extra armor welded over a vulnerable section. Others asked him to look over their ammo racks before the next mission, knowing full well he'd make changes the manuals never mentioned. It was risky, and Hayes knew that if inspectors ever found out, a court-martial was almost guaranteed. But each time a modified Sherman came back on the front with its crew alive, even after taking a hit, it felt like proof that he was on the right path. By late August, his notebook was full of sketches and notes, a kind of unofficial field manual built on blood and experience. It wasn't sanctioned, it wasn't standard, and it certainly wasn't safe for his career. But in a war where the enemy wrote new rules every day, Sam Hayes had decided he would too. The Army could punish him later if it wanted. For now, the mission was simple. Stop the killing, even if it meant breaking every rule in the book. It was well past midnight when Sam Hayes crouched inside the gutted carcass of what had once been Sherman. The air was cold and damp, heavy with the smell of burnt rubber and scorched paint. His flashlight beam danced over blackened interior, revealing twisted metal and melted fragments of what had been the crew's personal belongings: a dented canteen, a scorched photograph, a charred boot. Hayes had seen dozens of wrecks by now, but he studied each one the way a detective studies a crime scene, searching for patterns, for answers. This particular tank had taken a single armor-piercing round to its right flank before erupting into flames. The hull was intact enough to climb inside, which was why Hayes was there now, crawling through its skeletal remains with a wrench in one hand and a notepad in the other. It was there, in the eerie silence of that ruined machine, that the pieces began to fall into place. The path of destruction was unmistakable. The German round had punched through the side armor near the sponsons, the very place where rows of 75mm shells had been stored. The blast hadn't even killed the crew directly. It was the ammunition that had done the rest. Once the propellant ignited, the confined space turned into a furnace, and everything inside was consumed in seconds. Hayes traced the trajectory of the shell with his gloved hand, pausing where the metal was warped inward from the intense heat. Every wreck he examined told the same story. A hit near the sponsons, a chain reaction, and then nothing but ash and steel. He sat there for a long time, the depot around him silent, except for the occasional distant thump of artillery. The problem was obvious, the solution less so. The Army had designed the Sherman's ammunition racks where they were because it was efficient. The space along the hull sides was convenient, easily accessible for loaders, and it kept the center of gravity low. But in practice, it was a fatal vulnerability. The more Hayes thought about it, the more he became convinced that the shells didn't need to be there at all. If they could be moved away from the sponsons, or at least shielded from direct hits, the chances of catastrophic fires would drop dramatically. The idea sounded simple, but making it real was another matter entirely. Moving ammunition meant cutting into the tank's internal structure, rerouting brackets, and altering load-bearing supports, all of which were strictly prohibited for field mechanics. Even shielding the existing racks presented challenges. The armor thickness on a Sherman was already a compromise between weight and mobility. Adding more would strain the suspension and stress the drivetrain. And then there was the problem of space. Inside a tank, every cubic inch mattered. There was no empty room to relocate ammunition without redesigning other systems. Still, the more Hayes considered the obstacles, the more they felt like excuses. The stakes were too high to accept the tank's design as unchangeable. If the engineers back in Detroit weren't going to fix it, someone on the ground had to try. He began sketching ideas right there inside the wreck. What if he could build a secondary compartment, a kind of armor box, to isolate the ammunition from the rest of the interior? What if he could line the storage area with a fire-resistant material scavenged from other vehicles? What if the shells could be moved below the turret ring, where the armor was thicker and the risk of penetration lower? None of these solutions were perfect, but any one of them might buy a crew the seconds they needed to survive. By the time he climbed out of wreckage, the first pale streaks of dawn were spreading across the Normandy sky. Hayes felt something he hadn't felt in weeks, a sense of direction. Until now, he had been reacting to disaster, patching together stopgap solutions and hoping for the best. But this was different. This was a plan, a risky, unauthorized, career-ending plan, but one that could change everything. He knew the risks. Cutting into the tank structure, without orders, could lead to a court-martial. If something went wrong in combat, the blame would fall squarely on him. But he also knew that continuing to do nothing meant watching more men die in the same predictable, preventable way. Back in his tent, Hayes spread his notes across the workbench. The pages were filled with rough sketches, measurements, and calculations scribbled in the margins. He listed materials he could salvage: spare armor plates, asbestos insulation, water tanks from wrecked vehicles. He outlined the steps needed to reconfigure the ammunition racks. It would be difficult, dangerous work, and he would have to do much of it under the radar. But for the first time, the problem that had haunted him for months felt solvable. When dawn fully broke and the depot roared back to life, Hayes was already back at work, welding torch in hand, the first pieces of his plan taking shape. The Army hadn't asked him to do it. His superiors would never approve it. But none of that mattered anymore. What mattered was that every tank he saw return from the front was a chance to try, a chance to change the odds, a chance to make sure that the next time a German shell struck a Sherman's flank, the crew inside might actually live to tell the story. The warning came down the chain of command with all the weight of Army bureaucracy behind it. A memo from Ordnance Command, stamped and initialed, circulated through every maintenance unit in the European theater. No unauthorized structural modifications are to be made to armored vehicles under any circumstances. The language was clinical, but the message was unmistakable. Altering a tank without approval could void its maintenance records, compromise its reliability, and, if something went wrong in combat, make the responsible party liable for the consequences. In other words, careers could end before the next sunrise. For Sam Hayes, the memo was followed by a conversation that made the threat more personal. Captain Robert Keene, his commanding officer, summoned him to the depot office, a drafty shack furnished with a folding desk, 2 chairs, and a stack of maintenance logs that seemed to grow higher by the day. Keene was not an unkind man, but he was a by-the-book officer who believed in the system. He gestured for Hayes to sit, then slid a copy of the ordnance directive across the desk. "I know what you've been thinking," he said, his tone measured. "I've seen the sketches. I've heard the talk. But this isn't your job. You're a mechanic, not an engineer. Stick to the manual." Hayes listened without arguing. He had too much respect for Keene to push back, but inside he felt a familiar knot of frustration tightening. Stick to the manual. It was the same answer he'd been given every time he raised concerns about the Sherman's fire vulnerability. The manual hadn't saved the crews he'd scraped from burned-out hulls. It hadn't stopped ammunition racks from exploding. It hadn't offered a single solution beyond the same tired instructions for replacing parts and checking seals. Following the manual meant accepting the problem as inevitable, and Hayes had already decided he couldn't do that anymore. That night, after the depot fell silent and the last of the repair crews had turned in, Hayes pulled a canvas tarp over the back corner of the workshop and got to work. He had no authorization, no blueprint, and no guarantee that what he was doing wouldn't land him in front of a court-martial. What he did have was an idea and a growing conviction that it might work. From a pile of scrap near the perimeter fence, he scavenged sections of armor plating cut from destroyed Shermans and abandoned German vehicles. He hauled them inside under the cover of darkness, sparks flying as he trimmed them to size with a cutting torch. His first experiments were crude. He welded sections of plate over the interior sponsons, creating makeshift shields between the ammunition racks and the hull sides. It wasn't elegant. The extra steel added weight and made the compartment more cramped, but offered an extra layer of protection. Next, he tried something more ambitious. Using water tanks salvaged from a wrecked fuel truck, he built small, sealed compartments around the ammo storage. The idea was simple. If a shell struck the area, the water would absorb heat and shrapnel, reducing the chance of ignition. It was messy work. The welds leaked, the tanks were awkward to install, and the added weight caused balance issues. But each failure taught him something new, and with every iteration, the design improved. Hayes worked mostly alone. A few trusted mechanics, men who shared his frustration with the Sherman's vulnerabilities, helped keep watch for officers during these unauthorized sessions. They brought him tools, handed him rivets, and swore to silence if anyone asked why a tank in the corner of the depot was covered with tarps after hours. To them, it wasn't insubordination. It was survival. Many had friends in tank crews. Some had seen those friends burned alive. The risk of punishment felt small compared to the weight of that knowledge. The first time a modified Sherman rolled out of the workshop, it bore no outward sign of what Hayes had done. The changes were all inside, hidden layers of protection around the ammunition racks, reinforced compartments sealed with salvage bolts and improvised padding. Officially, it was just another repaired vehicle returned to service. Unofficially, it was a quiet act of defiance. Keene suspected something. He made pointed comments during morning inspections, his eyes lingering on the tarps and the piles of scrap steel that seemed to shrink every night. But without proof, there was little he could do. And when the first of Hayes's modified tanks returned from the front bearing fresh scars, but no sign of an internal fire, even Keene found it difficult to argue with the results. Still, Hayes knew he was walking a dangerous line. All it would take was one inspection from a higher-ranking ordnance officer, one combat incident blamed on his modifications, and his career, maybe even his freedom, would be over. But every time he thought about stopping, he remembered the faces of the crews he'd seen carried out on stretchers, and the resolve hardened in him again. The Army could threaten punishment all it wanted. He had decided that the only orders worth following were the ones that saved lives, and those were the ones he was now writing for himself, one unauthorized weld at a time. It was just after dawn on a cool August morning when the tank that would become known as Lucky Lady rumbled out of the maintenance yard. To anyone passing by, it looked like any other Sherman. The same squat profile, the same olive drab paint streak with mud and soot, the same faded tactical markings stenciled on its sides. But beneath the steel skin, it was unlike any Sherman the Army had fielded before. Corporal Sam Hayes stood off to the side of the yard with his arms crossed, watching the machine clatter toward the loading trucks that would take it back to the front. He tried to hide his nervousness, but his heart thudded in his chest. For weeks he had poured every ounce of skill and defiance into this one tank, and now it was leaving his hands. Once it crossed the depot's perimeter, its fate and his would rest entirely on what happened next. The modifications were rough, the kind of work that would have made an ordnance inspector recoil. The welds weren't clean, the steel plates didn't line up perfectly, and the padding around the sponson racks was cut by hand from scavenged asbestos sheets ripped out of wrecked vehicles. He had layered those sheets between the ammo storage and the hull walls, then soaked them with water before sealing them behind thin plates of scrap armor. The result was a patchwork of improvised protection, crude but purposeful, a barrier meant to stop the catastrophic chain reaction that had claimed so many Sherman crews. Hayes knew it wasn't elegant. He also knew that elegance didn't matter to a man trapped inside a burning tank. The crew assigned to Lucky Lady was skeptical at first. They had heard the whispers about Hayes's after-hours experiments, and while they appreciated the intent, no one trusted an untested modification when their lives depended on it. But they were also desperate. Reports from the front around Mortain told of German anti-tank guns tearing through Sherman platoons with surgical precision. The tankers knew the odds as well as Hayes did. A direct hit meant a fire more often than not. If there was even a chance the mechanics' strange work could change that, they were willing to take it. 3 days later, that chance came. The 3rd Armored Division was pushing toward Mortain, where German forces had launched a desperate counterattack in an attempt to cut off the Allied advance. The fields were alive with smoke and the crack of artillery. Hidden in hedgerows, German crews waited behind their packed 40 anti-tank guns, patient and deadly. Lucky Lady rolled forward with the rest of its platoon, its engine growling steadily as it advanced across a narrow stretch of farmland. Midway through the assault, a flash erupted from the tree line, the telltale muzzle blast of 75 millimeters round. The shell screamed across the open field and slammed into the Sherman's right flank. Under normal circumstances, that would have been the end. A hit there almost always meant disaster. The shell would punch through the thin side armor, ignite the ammunition racks, and turn the interior into a furnace before anyone could reach the hatches. But this time, something different happened. The shot penetrated the hull and buried itself in the shielding haze had welded over the sponson racks. The asbestos padding, damp from the water it had absorbed much of the blast heat. The ammunition, just inches away, remained intact. The interior of the tank filled with smoke and shrapnel, but there was no fire. The crew stayed alive. The tank's commander, Lieutenant David McConnell, later described those moments in his report. "We took a direct hit on the starboard sponson. I braced for fire. It never came. We stayed in the fight. Lucky Lady continued to fire for another 15 minutes before withdrawing for repairs. Battered, smoking, but still operational." For the first time since Hayes had begun his crusade against the Sherman's greatest flaw, a tank that should have burned had not. News of the incident spread quickly through the division. Mechanics, tankers, even officers stopped by the depot to hear the story firsthand. Hayes kept his head down and said little. He knew the success could be both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it was undeniable proof that his ideas worked, that a few changes in design could mean the difference between life and death. On the other, it was evidence of his insubordination. If anyone decided to make an example of him, the very modification that saved Lucky Lady could land him in a military prison. But something had shifted. Tank crews began asking if their Shermans could be fixed like McConnell's. Commanders who had once dismissed Hayes' efforts as dangerous tinkering now wanted to know how soon similar changes could be made across their units. Even Captain Keene, who had warned him in no uncertain terms to stick to the manual, was forced to admit that the results were impossible to ignore. "You might have saved 5 men with that stunt," he told Hayes, half in reproach, half in reluctant admiration. For Hayes, the moment was bittersweet. The experiment had succeeded, but it was only a beginning. The crude modifications that protected Lucky Lady were far from perfect, and they would need refinement before they could be scaled beyond a single tank. Still, as he watched the battered vehicle limp back into the yard days later, its paint scorched with its crew alive, he allowed himself a rare smile. It was proof that his late nights and risky decisions had not been in vain. The tank scars told a story no regulation manual ever could. Sometimes saving lives meant breaking the rules. The story of Lucky Lady spread faster than any official report ever could. It started as a rumor, whispered over tin mugs of coffee in muddy bivouacs, passed from one tank crew to the next like a piece of battlefield folklore. They said a Sherman had taken a direct hit from a German Pak-40 and lived. They said the crew stayed inside, kept firing, and drove back under their own power. Most of all, they said the tank hadn't burned, not a spark, not a flare, not the roaring inferno that everyone had come to expect. For the men who climbed into those machines every day knowing the odds, the story was more than a curiosity. It was hope, and hope traveled quickly through a division that had seen too many friends consumed by fire before they ever had a chance to fight back. Within days, the whispers had names attached. The tank was Lucky Lady. The man behind it was Corporal Sam Hayes, a mechanic with more stubbornness than sense. By the end of the week, crews were showing up at his workshop unannounced. Some came just to see the modified tank for themselves, circling it like an artifact, running their hands along the welded plates and tapping the reinforced sponsons as if to make sure the miracle was real. Others came with more direct requests. Could he make their tank like this one? Could he add the same shields, the same padding, the same changes that kept McConnell's crew alive near Mordine? Hayes was overwhelmed at first. The depot wasn't equipped for large-scale modifications, and he was still working mostly in secret. Each job required long hours of welding, scrounging for materials, and fitting armor pieces by hand. But as the demand grew, he couldn't bring himself to say no. He started working late into the night again, using every spare minute to reinforce tanks bound for front. Crews helped where they could, bringing him spare parts, bribing supply sergeants for asbestos sheets, even standing watch to make sure officers didn't stumble upon the unauthorized work. It was dangerous, it was exhausting, and it was absolutely worth it. The testimonies from the field reinforced his resolve. Crews who had gone into combat with Hayes' modifications returned with stories that mirrored Lucky Lady's near miracle. One tank reported taking 2 hits in the same engagement without igniting. Another was struck squarely in the sponson and still managed to fight its way out of an ambush. The changes didn't make the Sherman invincible. Far from it. But they bought crews precious seconds, sometimes enough to escape, sometimes enough to keep fighting. And in a war where survival was measured in seconds, that was everything. But where the tankers saw salvation, the brass saw a problem. The sudden demand for Hayes specials, as they were now being called, drew unwanted attention from higher up. Ordnance officers began to visit the depot more frequently, poking around the workstations and asking questions about material usage. Maintenance logs were audited, part inventories were double-checked, and Captain Keene found himself fielding inquiries he didn't want to answer. Officially, no one had authorized any structural changes to Sherman tanks. Unofficially, half a dozen vehicles now had modifications that looked suspiciously like the ones that had saved Lucky Lady. Keene called Hayes into his office again, this time with less patience in his voice. "Do you have any idea the kind of heat we're taking over this?" he asked, slamming a maintenance log onto the desk. "You're altering government property without approval. You're risking not just your career, mine too." Hayes listened silently, hands folded in front of him. He didn't deny the charges. He couldn't. But when Keene asked if he planned to stop, Hayes' answer was simple. "Not if it means they live." The captain sighed deeply, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He was a career officer who believed in the system, but he also knew that no technical manual or regulation could argue with the stories coming back from the front. Hayes' modifications were saving lives. Everyone knew it, from the privates in the foxholes to the commanders in their map tents. And that knowledge made the situation complicated. Punishing him outright risked demoralizing the crews who now believed their best chance of survival rested with his work. Ignoring the problem risked drawing the ire of Ordnance Command. In the end, the Army did what armies often do. It looked the other way, at least for the moment. As long as Hayes kept his modifications discreet and didn't slow the flow of tanks back to the front, no one came to shut him down. The brass neither approved nor condemned what he was doing. They simply let the results speak for themselves. And the results were undeniable. By late August, the workshop had become something of a pilgrimage site. Crews rotated through before every major push, bringing their tanks in for what they jokingly called a Hayes tune-up. Some brought bottles of whiskey or packs of cigarettes as thanks. Others simply shook his hand and told him that if they made a home, it would be because of what he'd done. Hayes accepted it all with quiet humility. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He was trying to keep men alive. And as the battles intensified and the division pushed deeper into France, that mission became more urgent with every Sherman that rolled out his bay, and more dangerous with every pair of eyes now watching him from above. The men from Ordnance arrived without warning one damp morning in early September, stepping out of their olive-green staff cars with clipboards tucked under their arms and expressions that betrayed no warmth. They were not field mechanics or line officers. They were inspectors, the kind of men whose authority came from regulations rather than rifles. Their mission was clear: investigate reports of unauthorized modifications to Sherman tanks and determine who was responsible. Word of Hayes' illegal work had finally reached higher headquarters, and now the Army bureaucracy was moving to bring it under control or shut it down entirely. The depot grew tense the moment they walked in. Mechanics who had once worked side by side with Hayes under canvas tarps now kept their heads down and their mouths shut. Even Captain Keene, who had always balanced his frustration with reluctant respect, seemed more distant. When the lead inspector, a major named Caldwell, asked to see the maintenance logs, Keene handed them over without a word. Hours later, Hayes was summoned to the office. The meeting was short and formal. Caldwell read the charges aloud from a typewritten page: unauthorized structural alterations to U.S. Army property, failure to follow ordnance protocols, and potential endangerment of government personnel and material. Each offense carried the possibility of court-martial. Hayes stood silently as the accusations were read, his stomach knotting with each word. Caldwell asked him directly if he had modified the tanks. There was no point denying it. Too many people knew. "Yes, sir," Hayes replied, his voice steady. "I did." Captain Keene, seated beside Caldwell, looked exhausted. "You've left me no choice," he said quietly. "You're to cease all unauthorized work immediately. Any further modifications, and I won't be able to protect you." It wasn't an idle warning. A court-martial would mean more than the end of Hayes' military career. It could mean confinement, dishonorable discharge, even prison time. The thought of it should have frightened him more than it did. But as he left the office, his mind wasn't on himself. It was on the crews who had trusted him, on the tanks that had come back from combat with their ammunition intact, on the faces of the men who had shaken his hand and told him they were alive because of his work. The news of the investigation spread quickly through the division. By evening, crews were gathering outside the depot, their conversations laced with anger and disbelief. They couldn't understand why the Army would threaten to punish the one man who had done more to keep them alive than any manual or memo ever had. Lieutenant John Merriman, one of the division's most respected tank commanders and a veteran of countless engagements, decided that silence was no longer acceptable. He and several other officers drafted a petition addressed to the division commander, outlining in precise terms the effect Hayes' modifications had already had on the battlefield. The petition was blunt. It cited engagement reports where modified Shermans had survived hits that would have otherwise destroyed them. It listed crew members who had returned home alive because their tanks hadn't erupted into flames. Merriman wrote a personal letter to accompany the document, calling Hayes' work a vital contribution to crew survivability and combat effectiveness. He didn't mince words about the stakes. If Corporal Hayes is punished, he wrote, we will be punishing innovation, bravery, and the will to protect American lives. The enemy's shells don't care about ordnance regulations. Neither should we. Copies of the petition circulated among the enlisted ranks as well. Dozens of signatures appeared within hours. Gunners, drivers, loaders, commanders, all men who knew the risks of armored warfare intimately. Some had ridden in modified Shermans themselves. Others had watched them survive hits that would have turned standard tanks into pyres. For them, this was more than a bureaucratic dispute. It was a fight over their own chances of survival. The petition reached division headquarters within 2 days. Whether it was the weight of signatures, the prestige of Merriman's endorsement, or the undeniable evidence that the modifications were saving lives, the tone from above began to shift. The investigation did not disappear, but its edge softened. Hayes was still formally reprimanded, and his record noted for disobeying orders. But the threat of a court-martial receded. The official explanation was that there was insufficient evidence of negligence or harm, a face-saving phrase that allowed Ordnance Command to step back without admitting it had been wrong. For Hayes, the reprieve was a mixture of relief and frustration. He was no longer staring down a court-martial, but his hands were still tied. The order to cease modifications remained in effect, and any further work risked reigniting the investigation. Yet the message from the men he served was clear. They believed in what he was doing, and they would fight to protect it. That knowledge gave him something the threat of punishment could not take away: conviction. In the weeks that followed, the depot settled into an uneasy equilibrium. Officially, Hayes obeyed the cease and desist order. Unofficially, crews continued to ask for his help, and officers continued to hint that the division might benefit from more of his field ingenuity. It was a delicate balance. One wrong step could tip it back toward disaster. But for the moment, Hayes had something that mattered more than orders or regulations: the trust of the men whose lives depended on his work. And in a war where trust was often the rarest commodity of all, that was enough to keep him going. The autumn rains had turned the roads of western Germany into rivers of mud when the 3rd Armored Division rolled toward Aachen in October 1944. The ancient city, its spires and stone streets scarred by weeks of bombardment, stood as the first major German city to face capture by Allied forces. It was also the site where Sam Hayes' work would be tested in full view of both the enemy and his own superiors. The talk of his illegal modifications had simmered quietly for weeks, tolerated but never officially recognized. Now, as Sherman Battalion prepared to breach the fortified outskirts, there would be no hiding from what came next. The fighting was brutal from the outset. German anti-tank guns had been carefully concealed in cellars, alleys, and rubble-strewn courtyards. Panther and Tiger tanks lurked among the ruins, using the broken cityscape as cover to ambush advancing columns. Every block became a battlefield, every intersection a trap. Normally, such conditions would have spelled disaster for Sherman crews. A hit to the sponson or turret basket was as good as a death sentence, igniting ammunition and leaving the vehicle a blazing wreck before reinforcements could even react. But as the days wore on, a curious pattern began to emerge. Several of the Shermans leading the advance had undergone Hayes's modifications before the ordnance clampdown. Their crews knew it, and so did their commanders. When those tanks were struck, something remarkable happened. They didn't always burn. In one engagement near the Pontegate, a Sherman named Iron and took 2 hits from a Pak-40 at close range. The side armor was breached. Fragments showered the crew compartment, yet the ammunition failed to ignite. The driver managed to reverse out of the kill zone, battered but alive. Witnesses swore that under normal circumstances the tank should have exploded, consuming its 5-man crew in seconds. Instead, the men climbed out shaken but breathing. Reports of similar incidents filtered back through the division's communication lines. In the narrow street south of Cathedral, another Hayes modified Sherman, Betty Lou, absorbed a glancing blow that tore through the sponson. The tank's commander later recounted that he had braced for the fireball he had seen so many times before. When it never came, the crew returned fire and pressed forward, supporting infantry who had been pinned down. It was not invulnerability. Several modified tanks were still knocked out in Aachen, but the difference in crew survival was undeniable. Where once the aftermath of a Sherman hit meant body bags and burned steel, now it often meant damaged tanks with living men. The division staff began compiling combat reports, comparing casualty figures between standard Shermans and those modified by Hayes's methods. The contrast was stark. Survival rates for crews and modified tanks were significantly higher, sometimes double, and the number of catastrophic fires dropped dramatically. What had begun as rumor and anecdote was now hard evidence, delivered in the cold language of after-action reports. For the first time, command could not dismiss Hayes's work as dangerous tinkering. They did not announce it publicly, nor did they issue orders endorsing further modifications, but quietly, in briefings and staff meetings, they acknowledged the truth. The so-called illegal changes were saving lives. Officers who had once threatened Hayes with punishment now studied the reports with careful interest, weighing whether the rules they enforced were costing more than they saved. Among the crews, the effect was even more profound. Confidence began to return to men who had long regarded their tanks as little more than rolling coffins. They still feared the ambushes, the mines, and the dreaded 88s, but the sense of inevitability surrounding every hit had begun to fade. Crews in Hayes-modified Sherman spoke of a new kind of resilience, a feeling that their chances of survival were no longer stacked so heavily against them. It was fragile hope, but it was hope nonetheless, and in Aachen, where every corner promised another trial by fire, that mattered. Hayes himself followed the reports with a quiet satisfaction he never voiced aloud. He kept working in the depot, officially repairing tanks, unofficially making small adjustments, whenever he thought he could get away with it. His superiors didn't stop him, though they didn't give him approval either. It was a gray zone, a space where rules bent just enough to allow necessity its say. He knew it was temporary, that sooner or later the higher commands would have to decide whether to embrace or reject his work. But for now, he had the validation that mattered most. Men were coming home alive because of what he had done. By the time Aachen fell in late October, the writing was on the wall. The modifications that had begun under canvas tarps and the cover of night were proving themselves in the crucible of urban combat. No amount of bureaucracy could erase the simple fact that lives had been spared. Quietly, and without ever admitting error, the Army's stance began to shift. The illegal work was no longer just tolerated. It was being studied, and though Sam Hayes remained just a corporal with grease-stained hands and little recognition, his defiance was shaping the battlefield in ways few could deny. By the time the smoke cleared over Aachen and the 3rd Armored Division regrouped for the next phase of the push into Germany, Sam Hayes' reputation had undergone a quiet but extraordinary transformation. Only a few months earlier, he had been a mechanic with grease under his fingernails and a reprimand on his record for unauthorized modifications. Now, the same officers who had threatened him with court-martial were asking him to walk them through the details of his designs. What had begun under a tarp in the back corner of a maintenance yard was suddenly the subject of official memoranda and technical meetings. Hayes, who had once worked alone in the dark, now found himself standing beside ordnance engineers at long tables covered with schematics, pointing out weld seams and explaining how water-soaked asbestos could mean the difference between a minor hit and a catastrophic fire. The shift didn't happen overnight. At first, The Army's interest was cautious, even reluctant. Inspectors were dispatched to study the tanks that had survived hits at Aachen and elsewhere. They took measurements, collected samples of the padding Hayes had used, and interviewed crews about what they had experienced in combat. The data spoke for itself. Modified Sherman showed a dramatic reduction in ammunition cook-offs, and crew survival rates were significantly higher. Field reports from multiple divisions corroborated the same conclusion. Whatever Hayes had done, it worked. The ordnance officers stopped referring to the changes as unauthorized alterations and started calling them field adaptations. Soon after, they began using a new term altogether, wet stowage. Wet stowage was a simple concept, but its implications were revolutionary. By surrounding ammunition racks with water-filled jackets, the system absorbed the intense heat generated when armor was penetrated, drastically reducing the likelihood of ignition. Hayes had arrived at the idea through trial and error, using salvage truck tanks and improvised fittings. Now, ordnance engineers refined it into something that could be manufactured on a production line. Sealed compartments, pressurized reservoirs, and standardized fittings that could be replicated in thousands of tanks. As the first prototypes of officially sanctioned wet stowage systems were assembled, Hayes was asked to consult directly on their design. It was a strange new role for him, part mechanic, part instructor, part witness. He was flown to workshops far behind front lines, where engineers peppered him with questions about his field modifications and the conditions that had inspired them. They wanted to know how he had sealed the compartments, what materials he had used, what challenges he had faced during installation. Hayes, still uncomfortable with the attention, answered as best he could. He didn't speak like an engineer, but he spoke like someone who had watched men burn alive and was determined never to see it happen again. That perspective mattered more than any textbook. By late October, the shift in doctrine was official. Draft bulletins circulated through the European theater of operations, instructing maintenance depots to prioritize wet stowage retrofits whenever possible. Plans were drawn up to incorporate the system into new Sherman variants coming off the assembly lines in the United States. What had been a forbidden experiment was now an Army directive. Hayes's name didn't appear on any of the documents. Innovation rarely carried the names of the men who first dared to break the rules, but those who had been there from the beginning knew the truth. The cultural change within the ranks was just as significant as the technical one. Crews who had once whispered about Hayes specials now spoke openly about wet stowage as a matter of doctrine. Commanders no longer had to justify why their tanks were being modified. They simply followed orders. Confidence soared as more Shermans rolled into battle, equipped with a new system. Tankers began to believe that their odds of survival were finally catching up to their courage. And for Hayes, the knowledge that his work was saving lives on a scale he had never imagined was more rewarding than any medal or promotion could have been. Still, he never forgot the path that had brought him there. The long night spent welding in secret, the reprimands, the threat of court-martial, they were reminders of how close his ideas had come to being buried under bureaucracy. And yet, they also underscored a deeper truth, that innovation in war often began not with committees or laboratories, but with a single person refusing to accept death as inevitable. By the end of the year, newly produced Sherman tanks arrived in Europe with wet stowage built into their design. They bore no plaque commemorating the mechanic who had first welded scrap steel over a sponson rack, but they carried within them the legacy of his defiance. Hayes still worked in the depot, still turned wrenches and patched armor, but when he looked at those tanks rolling off the transports, he felt a quiet pride. They were no longer rolling coffins. They were machines built with the lessons of blood and fire written into their steel. And while the war still had many battles left to fight, the men who rode into them now did so with a fighting chance, a chance forged not in a factory or a lab, but in the stubborn conviction of one mechanic who refused to follow the manual. The evolution from Sam Hayes' improvised field fix to a standardized engineering solution was a story of wartime necessity colliding with human ingenuity. Once ordnance officers accepted that the mechanic's unorthodox approach worked, the challenge became one of scale. How to turn a torch-welded, water-soaked patchwork into something that could be mass-produced, installed quickly in the field, and built directly into new tanks rolling off the assembly lines back home. The transition required teams of engineers, draftsmen, and metallurgists, but the core principle remained exactly as Hayes had envisioned it. protect the ammunition, and you protect the crew. The first step in refining the design was rethinking where the ammunition was stored. In earlier Sherman models, most of the rounds were housed in the sponsons, compartments along the sides of the hull, where they were easily accessible but dangerously exposed to enemy fire. Engineers proposed relocating the storage below the turret ring, in a recessed compartment closer to the center line of the tank. This lower position placed the ammunition behind thicker armor and reduced the likelihood of a direct hit penetrating the racks. It also shifted the center of gravity slightly downward, improving stability on rough terrain, an unexpected bonus of the redesign. The second and most crucial element was the introduction of liquid-filled jackets surrounding the ammunition compartments. Hayes' original solution, crude tanks of water-soaked asbestos wrapped around the racks, had demonstrated the concept, but was far from efficient. The engineers replaced his makeshift padding with sealed steel reservoirs filled with a glycol water mixture designed to absorb and disperse heat far more effectively. These jackets were pressurized to prevent evaporation and equipped with refill points, so crews could service them easily during maintenance. If an enemy shell breached the hull, the liquid absorbed the thermal energy, drastically lowering the temperature inside the compartment and preventing propellant charges from igniting. The results were immediate and dramatic. Testing conducted at Ordnance Proving Grounds showed a reduction in ammunition cook-offs of more than 75% compared to standard configurations. Simulated penetrations that would have previously turned a Sherman into a death trap now left crews shaken but alive. In some cases, tanks that would have been complete write-offs were able to continue fighting after sustaining hits. The system wasn't perfect. A catastrophic internal explosion could still occur if a round detonated directly, but the odds had shifted sharply in the crew's favor. The modification also sparked changes in how tank combat was approached tactically. With the risk of instant destruction significantly reduced, commanders began to deploy Shermans more aggressively, using them in tighter formations and more exposed positions without the constant fear of losing entire crews to a single lucky hit. Infantry units reported that tank support became more reliable, as vehicles that might previously have been knocked out could now remain in the fight. The psychological effect was almost as important as the physical one. Tankers began to trust their machines again. What made the transformation even more remarkable was how quickly it happened. Within months of Hayes' field experiment at St. Lo, American factories had incorporated wet stowage into new production runs of the M4A3 Sherman. The modified tanks were easily distinguished by their reconfigured ammunition racks and service ports for coolant refills. Even existing vehicles in Europe were retrofitted where possible, with field workshops installing the new system using prefabricated kits shipped from the States. The speed and scale of the implementation reflected the Army's recognition of just how vital the change was. For the men on the ground, the difference was visible every day. Combat reports noted fewer catastrophic losses, more recoverable vehicles, and crews walking away from hits that would once have been fatal. It was not an exaggeration to say that wet ammunition stowage saved hundreds, perhaps thousands, of lives before the war's end. Its success also influenced tank design beyond the Sherman. Future American tanks, from the M26 Pershing to post-war models, incorporated similar principles of ammunition isolation and thermal protection as standard practice. Even other Allied nations studied and adopted variations of the system, acknowledging the leap forward in survivability it represented. And yet, for all its engineering sophistication, the heart of the system remained rooted in the dirt floor workshop where it was born. It was the product of mechanics' refusal to accept that death by fire was inevitable, of long nights spent welding scrap metal and filling improvised tanks with water. The formalized wet stowage system bore the hallmarks of military precision: pressure gauges, technical manuals, production line tolerances, but its soul belonged to the stubborn corporal who had dared to think differently. As the war ground toward its conclusion, the Sherman, once derided by its crews as a Ronson lighter, became a safer, more resilient weapon of war. The change didn't erase the dangers of armored combat, but it tilted the odds toward survival in a way that nothing else had. What began as an act of defiance had grown into one of the most significant technological leaps of the conflict, a testament to the fact that even in the most industrialized war in history, a single individual with a wrench and an idea could still change the course of thousands of lives. The change that wet stowage brought to the Sherman wasn't measured only in engineering reports or casualty statistics. It was written on the faces of the men who climbed into those tanks and rolled toward enemy fire. Before the modification, the psychological burden of serving in a Sherman was something few outside the Armored Corps could truly understand. Crews joked grimly about their vehicles being death traps or one-way tickets, but beneath the gallows humor was real fear. Many men admitted that before every battle, they memorized the distance to the nearest tree line or building where they might sprint if the tank went up in flames. Some even practiced climbing out of hatches blindfolded, knowing they would have only seconds to escape if a shell found their ammunition racks. Survival often felt less like a matter of skill and more like a matter of luck. Sergeant Frank Delaney, a veteran commander who had fought from Normandy to the outskirts of the Rhine, later described the transformation as nothing short of profound. "Before Hayes' fix," he said, "you always fought with one eye on the escape hatch. You'd feel that knot in your stomach every time you heard a ping on the armor. If it was a hit, you had seconds, maybe less, before the whole thing lit up. Afterward, you trusted the steel. You trusted the crew. You trusted that maybe, just maybe, the tank wouldn't betray you." That shift in mindset was as important to battlefield effectiveness as any technical upgrade. Crews who no longer feared their own machines fought differently. Bolder, steadier, more focused on the fight in front of them instead of the fire that might consume them. The difference was obvious to those on the front lines. Tankers who had once hesitated to advance now pushed deeper into contested ground. Infantry who had previously seen Shermans knocked out in droves began to rely on them again for close support. Coordination between armor and infantry improved, not just because the tanks lasted longer, but because the men inside them were thinking offensively instead of defensively. They no longer treated every engagement as a desperate gamble. They believed they had a fighting chance. It wasn't just the veterans who felt the change. New recruits arriving at the front, many of them barely out of training camps, quickly picked up on the stories circulating through the ranks. They heard about tanks taking hits and staying the fight, about crews walking away from battles that would once have been their last. For them, wet stowage was more than a technical specification. It was reassurance. It told them that the Army was listening, that someone had cared enough to solve the problem that everyone had feared but no one had fixed. That knowledge did more for morale than any speech from a general. Letters home reflected this newfound confidence. Before the modifications, tankers often wrote about the fatalism of their work, how every mission might be their last, how they prayed their luck would hold just one more day. Afterward, the tone changed. They spoke of resilience, of surviving hits and living to fight again. Families noticed too. Some wives and mothers reported that their loved ones sounded different, more hopeful, more certain they would come home. In a war defined by industrial-scale destruction, that shift in attitude was no small thing. Of course, the fear never vanished entirely. The battlefield remained an unpredictable and deadly place. A well-placed shell could still cripple a Sherman, and not every hit was survivable. But the fear of inevitable fiery death, the fear that had haunted crews from North Africa to Normandy, began to fade into the background. It was no longer the defining feature of their work. Instead, they focused on tactics, on teamwork, on the mission itself. And that, in turn, made them more effective soldiers. Perhaps the most telling sign of the human impact came after the war. Veterans who had served in wet stowage-equipped Shermans often spoke of their machines with something close to affection. They remembered them not as death traps, but as partners, flawed, yes, but dependable in a way they had never expected. Some even credited the modification with saving their lives, not once but multiple times. They knew that without it, their names might have been etched into memorials instead of appearing on post-war census rolls. In the end, what began as a technical solution became something deeper. It changed how men saw their machines, their missions, and themselves. It turned fear into confidence, resignation into resolve. And while the battles of 1944 and 1945 would still claim countless lives, thousands more would return home because one mechanic had refused to accept that the odds couldn't be improved. For those men, wet stowage wasn't just a feature of the Sherman. It was the reason they lived to tell their stories. When the war finally shifted eastward beyond Aachen and the front rolled toward the Rhine, the name Sam Hayes never appeared in the communiques or the press releases that filtered back to Washington. There were no commendations read over loudspeakers, no ceremonies in his honor. His name wasn't printed on any factory blueprints or carved into plaques affixed to the new Sherman models leaving Detroit. In the official record, his contribution was buried under a sterile phrase, Field Modification Contribution, EDO 1944. It was a catch-all label used for hundreds of small innovations born out of battlefield necessity, a way to acknowledge them without drawing too much attention to the fact that they had often been born from breaking the rules. But while the official documents remained cold and impersonal, the truth on the ground told a very different story. Among the men of the 3rd Armored Division, Hayes was spoken with a reverence usually reserved for decorated officers or legendary tank commanders. Word of what he had done spread far beyond his own unit, passed from one crew to another until it became something of a soldier's tale. The story of the mechanic who refused to accept that tanks had to burn, the man who welded hope into steel when everyone else said it couldn't be done. For many, Hayes wasn't just a mechanic. He was the reason they were still alive. Crews who had survived direct hits would come back to the depot after an engagement and seek him out, sometimes wordlessly shaking his hand, sometimes just leaving a thank you note or a pack of cigarettes on his workbench before heading back to the line. Some gestures were more lasting. A handful of tankers kept small pieces of their modified Shermans, a section of welded plate, a scorched but intact ammo rack door, as lucky charms long after the war. Others carried photographs of Lucky Lady, the first tank to survive a catastrophic hit thanks to Hayes's work, tucked into their wallets or folded into letters home. For them, it wasn't just a memento, it was a symbol of second chances. They had walked away from battles they should not have survived, and they knew that somewhere in that chain of events, a mechanic's stubbornness had tipped the balance in their favor. Hayes himself never sought recognition. When asked about the modifications later, he shrugged off the praise with a characteristic modesty. "I just didn't want to see any more of those boys burn," he would say. He preferred to stay in the background, still working long hours in the depot, still repairing the endless stream of battered Shermans that came back from the front. His satisfaction came not from medals or citations, but from the quiet knowledge that his work mattered. Every time a tank rolled past the workshop and into battle with its ammunition secured and its crew confident, he felt it. Every time one came back battered but not burning, he knew he had done something right. The Army, for its part, did eventually acknowledge his contribution, though never publicly. Years later, buried deep in the appendix of a post-war ordnance report, there was a brief mention of the innovations that had improved Sherman's survivability. Field observations conducted in 1944 and 1945, it read, led to the development and rapid implementation of liquid jacket ammunition stowage, significantly reducing catastrophic losses. It was as close as the official record would come to crediting Hayes. Yet, even in that bureaucratic understatement, those who knew the story could read between the lines. After the war, many of the men whose lives he had saved tried to track him down. Some wrote letters addressed simply to Corporal Hayes, U.S. Army, Europe, hoping they would somehow find their way. Others visited reunions and veterans' gatherings, asking if anyone knew where the man who had built Lucky Lady had gone. Most never found him. Hayes returned to Illinois quietly, settling into civilian life and taking a job at a tractor repair shop not far from the farm where he had learned his trade. He rarely spoke about the war. When neighbors asked about his service, he would only say he kept the tanks running. But those who had fought in them never forgot. Decades later, at reunions of the 3rd Armored Division, veterans still spoke of him in the same hushed, respectful tones. They told stories of tanks that had taken impossible hits and lived, of battles where their survival had turned on a small, hidden change inside the steel hull. They raised glasses to the man with the wrench, to the stubborn mechanic who had given them more than just a better tank. He had given them a chance to see their families again, to grow old, to tell their stories. Sam Hayes never wore a medal for what he did, but among the men whose lives were shaped by his work, he was something rarer, a legend without ceremony, a hero without rank. And though his name never appeared in the history books alongside generals and statesmen, it lived on in the memories of those who had ridden into battle with a little less fear and a little more faith, because of the man who refused to accept that things couldn't change. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945 and the world turned its attention to rebuilding, the legacy of Sam Hayes' work did not end with the surrender of Germany. If anything, it was only beginning. The lessons forged in the heat and chaos of the European battlefields rippled outward, influencing not just the men who had survived because of them, but the entire philosophy of armored warfare for decades to come. Engineers and tacticians on both sides of the Atlantic began sifting through the wreckage of the war, analyzing what had worked, what had failed, and what could be improved. Again and again, one conclusion stood out. Survivability wasn't just about thicker armor or bigger guns. It was about designing vehicles that gave crews a fighting chance to live. The first tangible reflection of that new philosophy came with the introduction of the M26 Pershing. Conceived during the war, but fielded too late to see widespread combat in Europe, the Pershing represented a new generation of American tank design. Its developers had studied the grim lessons of the Sherman closely, and one of the most significant changes they made was the treatment of ammunition storage. The propellant charges and shells were moved into isolated compartments protected by armor and, in many cases, liquid cooling systems derived directly from the wet stowage principle. The lessons of Hayes' field experiment were now being designed into tanks from the start, rather than welded into them as an afterthought. The influence didn't stop there. As the Cold War began and armored doctrine evolved to face new potential adversaries, every major American tank design, from the M46 and M48 patents of the 1950s to the M60 of the 1960s, reflected the same fundamental idea, that protecting the crew and their ammunition was just as important as penetrating the enemy's armor. Ammunition racks were increasingly isolated from crew compartments, often fitted with blast doors or blowout panels designed to prevent explosions away from the interior. Many of these innovations were decades removed from Hayes' dirt floor workshop, yet engineers working on them routinely cited field-driven survivability lessons as their origin. It was an understated but unmistakable nod to the stubborn mechanic who had refused to accept that burning alive was simply part of the job. Even foreign militaries took notice. British Centurions, Soviet T-Series tanks, and eventually German Leopards all incorporated design elements aimed at minimizing the risk of ammunition detonation. The idea that a tank should protect its crew as much as it should destroy the enemy had become a universal truth in armored design. What had once been seen as a desperate, unauthorized field modification was now regarded as an essential feature of modern tank engineering. The legacy extended beyond blueprints and technical specifications. Military academies and ordnance schools began teaching case studies on wartime innovation, using Hayes' story as a prime example of how frontline improvisation could shape strategic thinking. Officers were reminded that doctrine was not immutable and that sometimes the most valuable breakthroughs came from those willing to defy procedure in the face of hard reality. Manuals that once warned sternly against unauthorized modifications were rewritten to encourage careful experimentation and field feedback. The Army had learned that rigid adherence to regulations could cost lives, and that flexibility, when tempered by necessity, could save them. For the veterans who had served in Shermans and their successors, the impact was deeply personal. Many of them followed the evolution of tank design in the years after the war with a sense of pride, knowing that their experiences and the work of one determined mechanic had directly contributed to safer, more survivable machines. At reunions, they marveled at the blowout panels and protected ammunition compartments on newer tanks, understanding that those innovations were not born in laboratories, but in muddy workshops and smoking battlefields. Even decades later, the lineage was still visible. The Abrams tanks that rolled across the deserts of the Middle East generations later were equipped with compartmentalized ammunition storage and blast deflection systems that could trace their conceptual ancestry straight back to 1944. Engineers designing those systems didn't always know Hayes' name, but they were following the path he had helped carve. Every tank that took a hit and kept its crew alive, every crewman who crawled out of a wreck and went home because an ammunition fire hadn't killed him, all of it was part of his legacy. Sam Hayes never saw himself as a visionary. He didn't set out to change the course of military engineering or shape the future of armored warfare. He was a mechanic trying to solve a deadly problem with the tools and scraps he had on hand. But history often works that way. The decisions made by ordinary people under extraordinary circumstances ripple outward in ways they could never predict. Hayes's defiance, his refusal to accept that the way things were was the way they had to be, became part of the foundation upon which modern tank design was built. It was proof that innovation could come from anywhere, that a single act of stubbornness could echo across generations. And though his name never appeared on the blueprints of the Pershing, the Patton, or the Abrams, it was etched into every bolt and weld that kept their crews alive. Long after the last Sherman rolled off the assembly line and the battlefields of Europe were reclaimed by fields and forests, Sam Hayes' story lived on, not in the halls of officialdom where medals and citations are handed out, but in the deeper memory of military history, where the real lessons of war are preserved. Decades passed, and the frantic urgency of those desperate years faded into history books and museums. But among historians, engineers, and veterans alike, one truth remained clear. What began as an unauthorized act of defiance in a muddy maintenance yard had become one of the most consequential innovations in tank warfare. Hayes's illegal modifications were no longer dismissed as rule-breaking improvisations. They were now recognized as a spark that ignited a revolution in how armies thought about keeping their soldiers alive. By the time the Cold War turned tank design into a global competition of steel and firepower, the story of Hayes and his wet stowage breakthrough was being taught in ordnance schools and officer training courses. Instructors used it to illustrate a point that was often lost in the machinery of military bureaucracy. Sometimes, progress requires someone to question the book. Students learn how a low-ranking mechanic, frustrated by the senseless deaths of men he served alongside, had refused to accept that regulations mattered more than results. They studied the chain of events his decision had set in motion, the redesign of ammunition storage, the changes in tactics, the dramatic increase in crew survival, and they came to see it not just as a technical achievement, but as a case study in moral courage. The language surrounding Hayes's work changed too. Where once it had been labeled a field modification contribution, historians began to describe it as a pivotal moment in the evolution of armored warfare. Books and documentaries on World War II now routinely include sections on wet stowage and its impact, tracing the idea back to a single workshop in Normandy and the man who refused to stop welding even when he was told to. The phrase illegal modification lost its sting, becoming instead a symbol of the human will to solve problems no matter the obstacles. What made Hayes' legacy so powerful was not just the number of lives he saved during the war, though those alone were significant, but the way his actions reshaped military priorities for generations. His work forced armies to confront a truth they had long ignored, that protecting soldiers inside their machines was not a luxury but a necessity. Before Hayes, survivability had been treated as a secondary consideration, often sacrificed for speed, firepower, or ease of production. After Hayes, it became a central pillar of design philosophy. Engineers designing tanks decades later spoke openly about crew protection as the heart of their work, citing lessons first learned on the battlefields of France in 1944. The human stories that flowed from his work gave those lessons weight. Veterans who had survived because of wet stowage passed their stories down to children and grandchildren, telling them about the mechanic whose stubbornness meant they had come home. In veterans' reunions, his name was invoked with gratitude and reverence. And in tank museums around the world, exhibits on the Sherman often include a quiet nod to the man who helped transform it from a feared death trap into a reliable fighting vehicle. Even outside the military, Hayes' story found resonance. Engineers, medical professionals, and even business leaders cited it as an example of how innovation often comes not from authority, but from those who see a problem up close and refuse to ignore it. It became a parable about courage, not the kind displayed on the battlefield with rifle in hand, but the quieter, more stubborn kind that refuses to let failure become routine. And yet, despite the accolades that eventually followed, Hayes himself remained an understated figure. He never wrote a memoir or gave interviews. He never sought recognition for what he had done. Those who met him in later life described a man who still thought of himself simply as a mechanic, someone who fixed what was broken. But those who knew the history understood the deeper truth. He hadn't just fixed tanks. He had fixed a way of thinking. The story of Sam Hayes endures because it captures something timeless about war, technology, and the human spirit. It reminds us that the greatest changes are not always made by generals or politicians, but by ordinary people who see a problem and refused to walk away from it. His torch, once lit in secrecy and defiance under a canvas tarp, became a beacon that guided generations of engineers, soldiers, and leaders toward a single principle: that saving lives is always worth the risk of breaking the rules. And in that enduring light, the memory of one determined man with a wrench continues to shine, long after the last tank he touched has turned to rust.